Moving forward to the concept of vulnerability, so looking at vulnerability to impacts as defined in this book, regardless of whether an event is triggered by a hydrometeorological, geological, biological, accidental, or antagonistic hazard, it will not result in unwanted consequences unless it occurs in a conducive setting. In other words, the system is not resilient, it's vulnerable. It's not resistant either. Such a setting is one determined by factors from all spheres of society, and it's primarily a result of human activity. This further explains the idea forcefully put forward already in the mid-1980s by Weichmann and Timberlake that most disasters stem from unresolved sorry, unresolved development issues. Destructive events are therefore not discrete, unfortunate, and detached from ordinary societal processes, but are intrinsic products of everyday human environment relations over time. So this is a very different way of saying it. This is just a prop used here. Vulnerability just ahead. We are constructing vulnerability. So it's like saying aging makes you vulnerable to flu, let's say, or to falling. Then this is part of the process, but we are here talking about vulnerability of society to events, hazards, which could be natural or man-made. This susceptibility to harm is referred to as vulnerability and is never a general attribute but must always be defined in relation to the impact of a specific hazard event. So in this sense we define vulnerability to hydroclimatic hazards, for example, to extreme events, heat waves, and so on, and then many indicators go into that vulnerability index. Could be per capita income, age, gender, location where you live, the kind of house you live in, and so on and so forth. However, vulnerability is not only associated with potential consequences but also with uncertainty in determining these consequences. Such uncertainty multiplies the potential risk scenarios, making a vulnerability analysis into the answer to three questions. What can happen given a specific hazard event? How likely is that to happen given that hazard event? And if it happens, what are the consequences? So this is framing vulnerability in a very different way, but it doesn't matter in the end in terms of building resilience and calculating risk and trying to reduce risk. In analogy with the concept of risk presented above, there is also uncertainty in the answers to these questions. If risk is defined as uncertainty about what could happen and what the consequences would be, vulnerability is defined as the uncertainty about what could happen and what the consequences would be given a specific hazard event. So you can see that the words do matter, and this framework is still very nice. The question is, how do you quantify risk and vulnerability in this sense? Since vulnerability is determined by physical, environmental, social, cultural, political, and economical factors, which we have the potential to address, we have the capacity to reduce our vulnerability to all possible types of hazards by adapting our human environment system. For instance, both the Bam earthquake in Iran and the San Simeon earthquake in California in 2003 measured 6.6 on the Richter scale, but the former killed more than 25,000 people in Iran, while the latter killed only 2 people. Of course, California is highly aware of the earthquake hazard, and there are building codes and so on, and make the system quite resilient or less vulnerable to earthquakes. It's rarely entirely fair to compare 2 earthquakes like that, as there are factors other than magnitude on the Richter scale that determine the destruction potential of the tremor itself. Could be on a hill slope, could be away from population centers and so on. However, it's still indicating vast differences in vulnerability, differences that are easy to find for most types of events between different places on our planet, generally connected to differences in development. However, it's not so that the poor always are the most vulnerable, even if that is so commonly stated within the international community. For example, the poorest people living in makeshift shacks may be less likely to die in an earthquake than the better off people living in unreinforced brick buildings. That said, it's rarely so that the really well-off people are worse affected than any other group living in the same location. So context is very important. The kind of house you live in versus the place you live in, and of course in the same place rich people and poor people may be very differently vulnerable. In other words, although level of development is a fundamental determinant of vulnerability, I urge caution in any generalizations that are not rooted in a specific hazard event. Okay, so that's important to remember. I'm jumping the text here. I'm not reading the entire chapter, lots of text, so I just keep taking the most salient points according to my own judgment. The only thing that's general is that vulnerability is highly contextual, and that different individuals and households differ in vulnerability depending on various factors and differences in access to various resources. For instance, gender and age are often decisive factors in determining the consequences of an event, though being regularly ignored, often resulting in women and elderly being disproportionately affected. However, to say categorically that women and elderly are more vulnerable even in relation to a specific event may overlook variations within these groups that may lead us astray. Remember the 1995 Chicago heatwave referred to in Chapter 4, which clearly indicated not only the need to disaggregate our population according to gender, age, ethnicity, etc., but also that vulnerability is about what is referred to as intersectionality, about the interaction of several factors that together result in marginalization in terms of access to vital resources, which in the Chicago heatwave case left elderly African American men more vulnerable than any other demographic group. Understanding intersectionality is, in other words, central for understanding vulnerability, as we'll see a figure in the next slide. The only way forward is thus to be mindful of the likelihood of variations in vulnerability when managing risk for sustainable development, to disaggregate data we collect and target our activities on the most vulnerable we find, whoever that is in each specific context. Finally, it's by reducing vulnerability that we have the greatest potential to reduce risk for sustainable development. So we're talking about risk and vulnerability, and anticipating risk, being prepared while reducing vulnerability. Okay, so here is what intersectionality is all about: the way different structures of power interrelate. So gender, sexuality, class, you can think of it as socio-economic class in the hierarchy, ethnicity, cohesion may be affected, as we saw before with Latinos versus other communities, and of course age, cutting across all of them. So you can see how this intersectionality determines the outcome of a hazard, and the overall vulnerability of any particular group may be dependent on age and gender, but maybe not always. So gender, for example, is going through here, and age is cutting across it, sexuality and class are cutting across it, but ethnicity is going here in different direction. Okay, so we'll come back and look at capacity to react and proact. There are lots of very nice details here, which I wish I could read all of it. It's about specific intrinsic biases we have. You know, you probably heard of positivity bias, negativity bias, confirmation bias, and so on and so forth. So all these intrinsic qualities we have, some of which are almost evolutionary and are meant to, you know, protect us in many ways, but they can become a problem in terms of taking action when risk is evident versus procrastinating, being proactive versus playing the wait and see game. So we have to understand those before we can begin to see how risk can be managed and sustainable development can be made possible. So it's a very interesting discussion. I'll pick the most interesting points, and you should definitely go back and read the chapter if you're interested in all of that. I find that thing very fascinating. It's almost kind of a psychoanalysis, which is interesting, but in this context we'll just read the most salient points. Okay, see you in the next podcast.